Today. And before we get underway, I'll just give you a little bit of information about how this will play out. We have an hour with Mr. Axelrod. I'll ask questions for about 45 minutes or so. We'll leave about 15 minutes for your questions at the event, as the tail end of the event. We're going to talk about his book today. We're going to talk about, which is actually quite a good book. And I'm sure a few of you will probably pick up a copy before you leave the building today. We'll talk about his book. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening in politics today. And so it'll be a good discussion, and we're delighted that you all could make time on this beautiful summer day, one of the few that we've had, and be with us today. So. All right, it sounds like we're about ready to get underway.
Okay.
All set? Okay. All right, we'll get underway. Good afternoon, everyone. Officially. Welcome to Exine Hall of Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by David Axelrod. As many of you people in this room know, David Axelrod was the senior strategist for then Senator Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. He played the same role in 2012. He also served 2 years as the president's senior advisor at the White House. Currently, David Axelrod is the director of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next hour or so. And he is also the author of this book. It's called Believer, My 40 Years in Politics. Won't you please welcome David Axelrod to Marquette Law School. Thank you. So I mentioned the book a couple of minutes ago, and it is a fascinating book. I think if you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, it's really interesting stuff. So let's begin with the book. And I want to begin with the title, Believer. So let us know what it is about politics that you believe in.
Well, you know, actually, what I wanted the cover to be Believer, How My Idealism Survived 40 Years in Politics. And the publisher felt that was too many words for the cover. But that's really what this book is about. You know, I came to this very young. Book begins at a rally in New York City in 1960. October 27th, 1960, John F. Kennedy came to Stuyvesant Town, which was the housing development where I grew up. And I was taken to this rally by this woman who virtually raised me, a woman who took care of me when my mother was at work, a wonderful, splendid African-American woman named Jessie Berry, who had come up from the South as a young woman and you know, no formal education and lots of wisdom, and worked and took care of other people's kids so she could take care of her own. And she decided that this would be important for me to see. So she came and put me on top of a mailbox so I could see. And I watched 20th Street, which was this big boulevard that was always filled with cars, now was filled with people. And I saw this young man with red hair jump up on a platform, and he started speaking, and his voice was booming off these buildings, and everybody paid rapt attention to him. And obviously, you know, I didn't get all of it at 5.
Right. Even though you were a very bright child.
I was precocious, but not that precocious. Right. And I can't tell you that I remember exactly what he said, but through the wonders of Google, I was able to recover the speech. And in fact, I was at the JFK Library last week, and they gave me his schedule and his actual remarks from that day, which is a prized thing for me. But part of what he said, and this is a rough approximation, was, I'm not running on the platform that says, if you elect me, everything will be easy. He said, being an American citizen in the 1960s is hazardous duty filled with challenge, but also hope. And we'll decide which path we take. And that, in a way, sums up what I believe about politics, that it's at its best, it's our opportunity to seize the wheel of history and ever so gently, because it's hard to turn that wheel, turn it in the right direction. And his brother, the epigram in the book is from his brother, and it is the future's not a gift, his brother Robert, the future's not a gift, it's an achievement. And that's what I believe. I think that we have the ability to shape our future, and the way we do it is through politics, and politics at its best can really make a great deal of difference. So that's why I'm a believer.
Yeah, you worked on campaigns as a kid. I found
Yes.
that interesting. So you did believe
9 years
even
old.
at that age.
9
Yes,
years old.
9
I
years
was
old.
out there I was out there for Robert Kennedy when I was 9. He was running for the Senate in New York. And the next year, and I wrote about this, I had this big wrestling debate in my head, and I broke with the Democratic Party. I was 10 years old. And I decided to work for a candidate for mayor of New York. I thought the Democrats had slated a hack for mayor of New York, and I went to work for a guy named John Lindsay, who many of you may remember he was a liberal Republican, and I think if you go to any museum of natural history, you can find some of those on display stuffed and all through my childhood, I got involved in campaigns, and including Robert Kennedy's very tragic campaign in 1968. And I actually came to Chicago as a college student because, in large measure, because I knew it was an interesting political town, and it was a great choice for me.
You went into journalism, and at a very young age, were able to get a job at the Chicago Tribune. Great stories in this book about Chicago politics. What did you learn about politics during your
that you
can share?
Yes. Well, look, Chicago politics. I came to Chicago because it was the home of the last of the big city machines. When I arrived there, the first mayor Daley was still in office, although the foundations of the machine had been shaken. And one of the reasons that they had been shaken was there was this growing black independent political movement. And I went to the University of Chicago. That black independent political movement really was centered there in that community and around that community. But there were some really great characters back then. Some of them are still around, some active, some not. One of, very famous character in Chicago politics, for better and worse, is a former alderman, Ed Verdoliak, who he was a young man when I arrived there. And in fact, I didn't put this in the book, but one of my first assignments when I was an intern at the Tribune, I was a summer intern, then I got a job, was to cover the mayor's versus city council, mayor's staff versus city council softball game. And Eddie Verdoliak was the captain of the softball team. And I was standing there taking notes, and there was Ed Verdoliak, and his two of his kids were there, and one of his little boys said, "Dad, these are great bats, can we take them?" Verdoliak looked over his shoulder and said, "No, son, those are Park District bats. They don't belong to us." And I took a few steps away, and I heard him say to his kid, "Just take a few." But it's sort of the governing ethic of Chicago. But Verdoliak, I started at the Hyde Park Herald newspaper when I was still a student writing about politics, and Mayor Daley had a stroke. And he disappeared for like 6 months. Nobody really knew where he was or how he was. And slate making for the next election was coming up, and one of the reporters said to Verdoliak, "Ed, what are you going to do? I mean, about slate making." He said, "What do you mean, what are we going to do? We'll do what we always do. Daley will tell us who we're for, and we'll be for him." And they said, "But Eddie, you don't even know if he can speak." And Verdoliak said, "He can point, can he?"
So despite that being a very rich environment for a reporter,
yes,
at some point I'll just say you grew less excited about the journalism profession.
I did.
Politics called you
I loved being a newspaper reporter. I literally was raised. My father passed away when I was a college student, and I wrote a little about that. I was kind of estranged from my mom, and I really grew up in the Chicago Tribune newsroom, and I had great editors who were all from the front page kind of era, and the story was everything, and they would be as excited about a story as you were. And I really, I did 2.5 years on nights covering, I wanted to be a political reporter. They knew that, but they thought I needed to learn how to actually be a reporter, and they put me on nights for 2.5 years covering murder and mayhem, which actually turned out to be a good preparation for Chicago politics. And by the way, I should mention, I talk about the characters. I also watched I got to cover the emergence of Harold Washington as mayor of Chicago, and it was just such an interesting time to see the transformation of politics that really laid the groundwork for Barack Obama's emergence years later. But what happened at the newspaper was that, like at every news organization, and you can probably relate to this, the ethos changed. It became more of a business than a calling in some ways, because there was so much economic pressure on the organization to perform better. They brought in a new set of editors who were much less affirming than the ones I had, much less committed to the story, I felt. And I just decided I didn't want to do journalism if I couldn't do it in the spirit and the way that I was trained to do. And a fellow came along, who many of you may remember, Paul Simon, who was running for the Senate in Illinois. And Paul was a great guy, the Orville Redenbacher of Illinois politics. He had the bow tie and the horn-rimmed glasses, big, huge ears. We used to joke about Paul Simon's plan for Lobel domination. But Paul was an incredibly admirable guy. He had dropped out of college and bought a newspaper when he was 19, and this was a bond between us, and in deep southern Illinois, and he used it to campaign against a crime syndicate down there. When he couldn't get anyone to run against them for office, he ran for the state legislature in his early 20s and got elected. And in the 1950s, as a legislator from a community that was, I think, closer to Little Rock than Chicago, rural community, he campaigned for civil rights and, in the legislature and in the law. He worked for political reform in the Illinois legislature, which is still hard today. I felt like if I was going to make the shift from journalism to politics, that Paul would be the guy to do it with, that he would never embarrass me. And I went over there as a communications director and ended up as a campaign manager, and we ended up winning in a year that Ronald Reagan was carrying the state by 500,000 votes. So it was quite a baptism into politics.
I was going to say, that's heady stuff, because that's your first campaign.
I was 29,
Yeah, and so now you've done, what, 150?
Yes.
Campaigns?
Yes, I'm not 29 anymore.
So this will be, who's your favorite child question, but who were some of your favorite candidates to work for? I mean, people who lived up to the potential you saw in them, or maybe even exceeded that.
Well, Paul certainly was one of them. And in 1988, when he ran for president, I had already made the move into media. I'd worked for Harold Washington in his reelection. Harold was one of my favorites.
You said a gifted politician.
Oh my God, one of the most charismatic people I've ever met. And Harold was a wonderful mix. He was born into ward politics on the south side of Chicago. His father was a precinct captain. He became a precinct captain. The Democratic machine recognized talent in him, and he went to Northwestern Law School, and they quickly promoted him, sent him to the legislature. But Harold also was a very independent thinker, a real intellectual. You'd go over to Harold's house and there were books like piled everywhere. And Harold really resented being told what to do, particularly on issues that were important to the African American community. And he became more and more rebellious over time, and ultimately, became a leader of the Black independent movement in Chicago, got elected improbably because of a three-way split in 1983, and I got to work with, and I got to cover that story, which was a great story, and then I worked with him in 1987, and my favorite story that says a lot about Harold and how he saw his role in history and maybe the politics of cities was the day Jane Byrne was his predecessor, and Jane ran as a reformer in 1979. Some of you may remember her. and then systematically, and that was my big breakthrough, I covered that campaign, systematically abrogated every promise she made, reform promise, and governed as kind of a parody of a machine mayor. Now she came back in 1987 and ran against Harold, and she was actually leading in the polls for a good period of time in that race, and we ultimately prevailed, and he won by 80,000 votes, and we were sitting in his office the next day, and we're all very happy. He's about to do his victory press conference, post-election press conference, and he said, what percentage of the white vote did I get? And someone said, well, 21%, but that's really good because last time you only got 8. And Harold said, 21%. He said, I've spent 70% of my time in these African-American neighborhoods, in these black neighborhoods, and in these white neighborhoods, and I think I've been a good mayor for the whole city, and I got 21% of the white vote, and we're all happy about it. And he kind of smiled wanly and shook his head and said, ain't it a bitch to be a black man in the land of the free and the home of the brave? But he was a powerful, powerful guy, loved politics. So he was a great one. Simon was a great one.
Paul Patrick?
Oh my goodness, yes. I was with him yesterday. He's on the board of my Institute of Politics. That was one of the thrilling campaigns in my life, working with Deval Patrick in Massachusetts, only the second African-American governor since Reconstruction. And just in every way, an admirable person. Grew up on the south side of Chicago, actually, and in withering poverty. And he got a scholarship to go to Milton Academy in Massachusetts through some program for public school students. And he just excelled and went to Harvard and Harvard Law and became a civil rights lawyer and had great success and ran for governor. Nobody gave him a chance. And he just inspired, let's say his campaign, and I had this period of time where I worked for Barack Obama in 2004 in Illinois, just a wonderful come-from-behind campaign that was the forerunner of the 2008 campaign. Worked for Deval in Massachusetts in 2006, real grassroots campaign. First time we really saw the power of the internet to organize, but mainly it was Deval just inspired people to believe. His admonition all the time was to ask people to put their cynicism down and take a chance on hope, he would say. And he was a great governor, has a great legacy in education in all kinds of areas in Massachusetts. So he was a great one. Tom Vilsack, the former governor of Iowa, now Secretary of Agriculture. I worked for him. He was the first Democrat to get elected in 32 years. And when I went to see him when he first was running, he was a state senator, and there was another candidate who was 20 points ahead, and we came from behind in both the primary and the general. And he was a really admirable governor. One of the things he did that almost cost him his career there was he made the argument that Iowa should actively seek immigrants to come to Iowa because they were losing population. And it was absolutely the right thing to do, but it spurred this kind of nativist reaction. And I was in the legislative chamber when he made the speech urging the state to go in this direction. And, I'm attracted to people who understand. I mean, the world of politics divides into two categories, one more numerous than the other. There's the category of people who run for public office because they want to be something. And then there's this smaller, more admirable group of people who run for public office because they want to do something. They see it as a calling and not a business or an exercise, an ego aggrandizement. And Vilsack was one of those people, And, I'm attracted to those people, and those are the believers. Those are the people who believe that public life and politics is about something larger than their own advancement.
Not all the candidates are perhaps so high-minded or honorable as it turns out, and I won't ask you to name names on that, although you do talk about a few of them.
Look, I've been associated with them too, so, I wrote in this book about a number of them, including Rod Blagojevich. You guys know him? It always engenders the same reaction. But I worked for Rod when he was a congressman, or when he was a state legislator running for Congress. I thought he was pugnacious guy who had a real sense for working class people and so on. But when he came to ask me about running for governor, I was a little concerned, and I said, well, why do you want to be governor? He said, well, you can help me figure that out. And I said, look, if I have to help you figure it out, you shouldn't run. And that was the end of our relationship. But then later in that year, this was 2001, 2002, by the summer, he was winning that race. And he hired a state-of-the-art kind of firm who were doing all the state-of-the-art things. Our last governor was also on his way to prison, George Ryan. And so he ran as a reformer. And he ran on a no-tax pledge in a state that desperately needed new revenues. And he was going to win. And I was depressed by the cynicism of it. And I was going through this existential crisis. And I got a call from an old friend,
I was going to say,
Barack Obama.
The two of you
who was
were
going through his own
thing.
existential crisis because he had decided to run. He was a state senator. He decided to run for Congress in 2000 against a sitting incumbent, and he lost narrowly by 30 points. And he was broke. And he called me and he said, "I got one race left in me. I promised Michelle that I'm going to take one more stab at this, and if it doesn't work out, then I'll go and make a living and support my family." And he said, "So I want to run for the U.S. Senate." And he wasn't he was a highly touted person, but not a highly touted candidate. Had no money, had just lost, was named Barack Obama. This was 1 year after a guy named Osama bin Laden destroyed the World Trade Center. He was African American, and Illinois is a big, diverse state, and there were others who had more money, more name recognition, more organization. But I said to my wife, Susan, that if I could help Barack get elected to the Senate, that would help me recharge my batteries. That would re-engage my idealism. And then that was the beginning of an incredible run.
It actually began even before he was elected to the Senate with that speech that I'm sure some people saw in this room at the Democratic National Convention. When you saw that speech, did you know that this ride might take you further than just Springfield? Or
not just when I saw the speech, but when I saw the speech draft. What happened was these things just don't drop in your lap. You kind of have to subtly lobby for them, and we did. And finally, the call came. We were driving down in southern Illinois again, and there was no phone service. It's sporadic. So it took 3 tries to complete this conversation with Mary Beth Cahill, who was John Kerry's campaign manager, but she said, "We want you to give the keynote address." And as soon as he hung up the phone, Obama said, "I know what I want to say." And I said, "What do you want to say?" He said, "I want to talk about my story as part of the larger American story." And in the next few weeks, he would write on scraps of paper as he drove around the state campaigning, and he was still in the state Senate. So he would go into the men's room in between votes, and he'd, write down thoughts. And he finally pulled it all together, and it was a week when I was on vacation with Susan, and we were overseas, and my office sent this copy that he had emailed it in the middle of the night, which is almost always when a Barack Obama speech arrives. Because he does this, that's when he works. Like after his kids go to sleep, he works late at night. And I was looking at it, and first page, second. By the third page, I thought this could be one of the great convention speeches of all time. And then when he gave it, I was on the floor of the convention, standing with Robert Gibbs, our press secretary, and I saw the way people were reacting around the arena. I had been in the arena in 1984 when Mario Cuomo had given his famous speech at the Democratic Convention in San Francisco, and I saw how instantly he was propelled into the national picture. And I said to Robert, I think, his life has just changed, and our lives may have just changed. And that turned out, the next day, wherever we went, Barack was swarmed by people, and that was the beginning of the juggernaut.
It was hard to tamp those questions down because people kept asking, and yet, if you go back to 2008, 2007, 2008, Hillary Clinton was thought to be the the Democratic nominee, that it was hers to lose. And
Yeah.
was that
I know where you're going with this.
Was that a daunting No, maybe later, but was that a daunting proposition for you, as a, knowing that she's well-funded,
Well, it was daunting. It was. Let me just speak from my own vantage point, and then I'll talk about it strategically. It was daunting for me, or personally, because I had a friendship with her, with President Clinton. I had worked on her Senate race in 2010, and I had told her people who had come to me and asked if I would work on her presidential campaign in 2006 that Vilsack was running at the time, Chris Dodd was running, who was a client of mine. I had worked for John Edwards, which is a whole nother story.
That's in the disappointments category,
yes,
we talked about earlier, yeah.
Exactly. But I had, all these clients who were running, and I said, I'm not going to get involved unless Barack runs, because we're super close, and but I'm very, very sure he's not going to run, and I really didn't think he would. And then, but by the end of the year, there was a real groundswell for him to run, and we had done some look. We took a look at it late in 2006, and I wrote a strategic memo to him and said that I thought that it actually was a good time to run. Because I believe that when we have presidential elections, particularly succession elections, and we're about to have one, people always choose the remedy to what they have. Even if the president is popular, they rarely choose a replica. And Barack Obama was the antithesis in many ways of George W. Bush. He was not a partisan figure at that time. We can talk about later what's happened since. He was a very thoughtful and reflective guy, and saw the gray, and that was not Bush's profile. And so in many ways, he was the perfect antidote. And I had seen the power of him as a candidate in 2004. I also believed that, as I told him in this memo that I sent him, that the history is replete with cases of people who waited too long. Very rarely do you hear cases of people who went too early. And I didn't think marinating in the juices of Washington for a decade was necessarily the best for him if that's what if he wanted to run for president. So, and then I just, as a believer, I believed in him. And I thought that we had a great story to tell and a great message for the country. So, but when we met to talk about this, there were 8 of us in the room. That was the entire Obama for America organization. And 2 of them were Barack and Michelle. So, we knew that the Clintons had, 25 years of associations, would have a lot of money. And, so one of the questions that Barack asked was, can we compete with that? And that was a lot of what our discussions were about. A lot of them also were about why we should, because he wanted to make sure there was he wasn't one who was going to say, I'm going to run and you can tell me why. He wanted to feel that it was the right thing to do, and he wanted to know exactly why he wanted to do it. And so he went through a lot of reflection on that. But what we finally concluded was that there was a hunger for a different kind of candidacy, and that in this modern age with social media, that we could very quickly organize people around the country, that there was a potential to raise a great deal of money through small donations online, and that there was a real possibility that Iowa was a place where we might be able to break through. So, the politics ultimately, I think, looked pretty good to us. My concern for him, Mike, wasn't, as I told him, he came into my office on January 2nd, 2007, when he was just on the cusp of making the decision, and I told him, my concern for you isn't that you're going to lose, it's that you're going to win. And I knew what being president of the United States entailed, what running for president of the United States entailed, and I knew it better than him because I'd been around longer and I'd been involved in politics longer. And, I was concerned, and I told him, I said, I don't know if you're pathological enough to run for president. because it takes pathological drive to run for president. I said, I know some of these other people, they're going to drag themselves out of bed at 4 in the morning every day because they have to be president. And I don't sense that you have to be president. And he said, well, you're right. He said, it turns out that being Barack Obama in and of itself is a pretty good gig. And he said, I love my family, I love my friends, I like watching a game on TV. There are other things in my life, but he said, if you're going to do public service, then do it at the highest level you can, where you can have the biggest impact. And he said, I'm competitive. If I get in, and I knew that, if I get in, believe me, I'll find a way to do what I need to do.
You describe him in the book as idealistic and pragmatic, but also you point to, there's at least from your point of view, a sense of calm about him. And there's a story in here that I was not aware of, maybe some people in this room are, but a story in here about the day before the inauguration in 2000.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that sort of exemplifies what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And maybe you could share that briefly with us.
Yes, well, we already were wrestling weeks before. I mean, we met just briefly before I get to that story because it gives you a sense of what we faced when we came to the presidency. But we met in mid-December in Chicago and had a briefing from our economic team that was absolutely, frightening. Christine Romer, who is going to become the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, was an expert on the Great Depression. She said, we're in the midst of a recession that's as deep as the Great, that will be as deep as anything since the Great Depression. Larry Summers said 1 in 3 chance that we'll have another depression. Tim Geithner said the financial system was locked up and could collapse. And then to cheer everybody up, the budget director said this is going to add trillions to the deficits. And Obama said, when he heard the report, he said, well, I guess it's too late to ask for a recount. So we better figure out what we're going to do. And we were in the midst of that. But the night before the inauguration, I got a call from Rahm Emanuel, who was our incoming chief of staff. And he said, give me a call on a hard line. And I did. And he said, I've been with Chertoff and the Homeland Security people, Bush's Homeland Security people all day, and there's a credible threat on the inauguration. There were concerns about 4 Somali American kids who had gone out of the country and were now had slipped back in, and there was some concerning traffic that they had heard, and he said, it's possible that we may have to disperse the inaugural ceremonies, and I need you, because I can't read any of the speechwriters into this, to write a 60-second speech for the president asking the crowd to disperse. And you can give it to him in the speaker's office right before he goes out to take the oath. And if he needs to give it, the Secret Service will tap him on the shoulder and he'll go up to the podium and he'll deliver this. And you talk about your kind of welcome to the NBA moment. It was just kind of stunning. And Rahm said to me, and you can't tell anyone. And Susan and my young son Ethan were staying with me in my new apartment in Washington. And all night long, I was up listening to sirens in the night, wondering if this was related to what I had learned. And the next morning I woke up, and Susan and Ethan were going to go to church services with the Obamas and the Bushes, the traditional pre-inaugural church services. I couldn't go because I was going to do television. And all I wanted to do was tell them not to go. I was so frightened that something was going to happen there, and then I would have to live with that knowledge that I could have stopped them from going, but I was sworn not to tell. And, happily, nothing happened. And but it was a reminder of the grave responsibilities that we were going to, that we were about to undertake. And, you mentioned his calm. I think that you don't really know. I mean, I knew Barack Obama well from the time he got back to Chicago from law school, but you don't really know someone as a potential president until you go through a campaign with him. And at every juncture in our campaign, when we had a crisis or a problem, he was the guy who kind of kept his wits about him and exercised good judgment and led the team forward. So I knew that I'd seen that quality, and by the way, we spoke about this earlier. I think that's one of the great things about of this maddening, sometimes absurd, and way too long process that we have, is that you do get to know these people, and it is kind of, as I said, an MRI for the soul, you know. So I knew him better at the end of that campaign, and that quality has really, in the 2 years I was in the White House, served him very well, because the presidency, even in good times, is like serial, impossible decisions. That's one after another after another. And we were not there in ordinary times. We had an economic crisis, we had 2 wars raging, we had an ongoing terrorist threat, and he had to make a series of decisions, particularly on the economic side, that were as unpopular as they were necessary. And he did these things unflinchingly, for which I had great admiration.
You, in this book, you make what I think could be characterized as a strong defense for the actions the president has taken, what he's done. But you also admit, towards the end of the book, and we talked about this earlier at another venue, that you deeply regretted you weren't able to change the rancid politics of Washington,
yes,
you called it. Why weren't you able to
Some
change
things are too true not to admit. I mean, look, it was a fundamental tenet of our campaign, and one that he deeply believed in. I mean, if anyone who knew Barack Obama in Springfield knew that he was famous for building bipartisan coalitions. He used to, he had great relationships across the aisle. He played poker every week. He had a poker game, Republicans and Democrats, and he was bipartisan in his willingness to take their money. And he was very successful in Springfield, and his assumption was that he could, and he did bipartisan things in his brief time in the Senate with Dick Lugar on proliferation, with Coburn from Oklahoma, a very conservative senator, on some government reform measures. He thought he could build coalition, but here's what happened, in my view. We won such a commanding victory in 2008, and we swept in large majorities in the Senate and the House. The Republican Party was in disarray and in distress, and the leaders of the party in Washington, Senator McConnell in particular, but others on the House side, understood that, and they made a decision. They knew that we were going to have to make these unpopular decisions to deal with this raging economic crisis. They knew that crisis wouldn't abate quickly, and their best chance for 2010 was not to cooperate, but to allow us to wrestle with these problems on our own, and then run against us for the decisions we had to make in the slow pace of recovery. And that's what they did. And each time the president had to rely almost entirely on Democrats to take steps forward, it allowed the Republicans to depict him as a partisan and polarizing figure, and it just fed on itself, and it hasn't abated, obviously. So that is a big disappointment. I would say also, though, that to me, the measure of success is not just that, because the sort of promoting a different kind of politics was a vehicle to try and get things done. Getting things done is ultimately how you're going to get judged. I saw a president lead this country out of the deepest economic crisis we'd seen in 80 years. I remember sitting in a room with him and others when he was trying to decide what to do about the auto industry, and there was a proposal on his desk about intervening to save the American auto industry, GM and Chrysler, and it was a very dicey decision because it wasn't at all guaranteed that it would work. And people now look back, as we're seeing auto companies add shifts and cancel their summer break because they're manufacturing so many cars. People look back and say, well, that was an obvious decision. The country was deeply, deeply opposed to it then, even in Michigan. And, and I saw him make those decisions, and we know what the result of those were. Healthcare. which was probably the most controversial of all, remained so. I argued against it.
Taking it on as an issue.
I was worried about it because seven presidents had tried, 7 presidents had failed. I knew what the polling was. I knew what the communications problems and challenges would be in it, and it frankly, it concerned me, and yet I also knew, because I had had trials in my own life. I have a daughter who, when she was 7 months old, we found blue and limp in her crib. We thought she had died. And it turned out she had had a seizure, and she would have thousands more until she was 19, when we finally found a combination of medications that worked. But in those early years, I was a young newspaper reporter. I almost went bankrupt because I was making $38,000 a year and paying $10,000 out of pocket for her medications because her insurance wouldn't cover it, and we couldn't move insurance because she had a pre-existing condition. So I didn't need a tutorial on the problems of the healthcare system, but my job was to provide political advice. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, well, what are we supposed to do, put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for 8 years? Or are we going to draw down on it to do things that are of lasting value to the country? And he pushed through that process. And every time it looked like we were done on healthcare, he kept us going. I went into his office in the summer of 2009 with polling data, not to persuade him to stop, because once he was in, I was in, but I wanted him to know we were taking on water. And he said, yeah, but I just got back from Green Bay, and I met a woman 36 years old with 2 children. She's married. They have insurance, but now she has stage 4 breast cancer, and she's dying, and she's worried that she's going to leave her family bankrupt. And by then we were standing in the Oval Office. I could feel his hand in the back of my back, kind of leading me out of his office. And he stopped at the door, and he said, that's not the country we believe in, so let's keep on fighting. And then later that summer, someone was making the argument that we should throw in the towel, and he said to Phil Shalero, his legislative aide, Phil, what do you think the chances of passing this bill are? And Phil said, well, it depends how lucky you feel, Mr. President. And Obama smiled and said, Phil, I'm a black guy named Barack Obama, and I'm President of the United States. He said, I feel lucky every day. And as I told you earlier, Mike, when the bill passed, we were all gathered in the Roosevelt room, which is the conference room adjacent to the Oval Office, and my office was next to his. And as the final votes came in, I kind of involuntarily got up and went into my office and closed the door, and I started crying. And I mean, just a very, not little whimpering cries, but big sobs. And I was sort of I surprised myself. And then I realized it was because I knew that because of what he had done and what we had done to help him, that other people wouldn't have to go through what my family had gone through. And I went and I found him and I said, Mr. President, I just want to thank you on behalf of all the families who won't have to go through what my family's gone through. And he's a good friend, so he knew that story. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, that's why we do the work. And that to me is the essence of all of this. I always remember that story. Why do we do the work? And if you have a chance to make a lasting difference for people, that's a big deal. So yeah, I regret that we weren't able to change the tenor of politics in Washington, but I'm proud of the many things that we achieved and that he achieved.
Let me just take a few minutes and talk modern day, current politics, and then we'll take a few questions.
This wasn't that long ago.
No.
Probably feels that way.
It does, yeah.
So here we are, 2016. Is the word inevitable used to talk about Hillary Clinton? Right now you've got 2 Democratic candidates, Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley. Do they have any chance in this race? Or
well,
you don't like the word inevitable, do you?
No, and I don't like, and I've been around long enough not to say no one has a chance, anyone has no chance, but I mean, the high likelihood is that Hillary will be the nominee, but having said that, I think inevitability is not her friend. I think it's a real burden. In 2007, I saw two Hillary Clintons in 2007 and 2008. In 2007, she was really kind of constrained in this straitjacket of inevitability, and she carried that inevitability around like a porcelain vase, and she was very cautious, venturesome, unrevealing, and then she lost the Iowa caucuses, and she became a different candidate. She threw all that caution away. She was much more revealing of herself, much more connecting with other people, much more of an advocate than she had been. And in my view, a very effective candidate. It was just too late. But the question I think that she'll have to answer is, which candidate is she going to be in 2016? Because once again, there's this veil of inevitability, and there is a temptation to be cautious. But there was an old baseball manager in Chicago in the 1960s, Eddie Stanky, and Eddie Stanky said, "No risk baseball is second division baseball." And that's true in politics too, and when you run for president, you have to take some risks along the way. Risks, one hopes, for the things that you believe in. And I think that's the challenge for her if she's going to go all the way, but I certainly think she has a good chance to do that.
We've got a lot of a lot of Republican folks who are considering or have
Yes.
announced already.
Yes.
Governor Walker is presumed to announce sometime possibly later.
He seems interested.
He does. But I'm wondering what you think of his chances in this very crowded Republican field as you sort of watch this thing play out.
Look, I think that if you were to handicap the race now, and it's always a foolish thing to do, he would be in the top tier of candidates, or close to the top tier of candidates. I think that the year favors executives and governors over legislative candidates. Barack Obama was only the third senator since the turn of the 20th century to win the presidency, and there is a predilection for people who hold executive offices. I think that's in his favor. He's thrilled the base with his unrelenting war on unions, and he talks about it often. He is now emphasizing his roots, his father's roots as a minister, and appealing to social conservatives, and he is a very practiced and accomplished politician. He's been through the wars here, and many of you have witnessed them. I think that he has to be taken seriously, but I've learned that you never can judge this far out how a candidate's going to deal with the challenges of the presidency. Running for president is like high jumping or pole vaulting. You clear the early bars and you look good doing it, but as soon as you clear the bar gets raised, and the process gets harder as it moves on. How Governor Walker will handle that, I think, is an open question, because running for president of the United States is a little more, there are more dimensions to it than running for governor of Wisconsin. And one of the things that I'd be concerned about is that my understanding is, I'm not close to your politics here, but that he tends to run his own campaigns, that he's his own political strategist, his own tactician. You can't run for president like that. It's too hard. It's hard enough to be a candidate. One of the strengths of Barack Obama was he set the direction for us, and every time we strayed, he would call a meeting and he'd ask us a lot of hard questions in terms of justifying what we were doing. We'd make adjustments at times. At times he would be satisfied. But he was the chairman of the operation, not the CEO. If you try to do both, you're not going to do either well. So I think that's a pitfall for Walker. I think that he has to be taken seriously, but he has a lot to prove yet in this race.
I'll give you a minute here at the end to talk about the work you're doing at the University of Chicago and why that was the next phase.
Well, I mean, in a sense, it goes part and parcel with this book. I decided after the 2012 election that 150 campaigns were enough, and that I would never have a partnership like the one I've had with President Obama, and a journey like that one, and everything else would seem disappointing in contrast. So I decided that the best thing that I could do would be to try and inspire young people to get into the arena. You know, I think this is one of the most public-spirited group of young people that I've seen since the 1960s. They've lived through war, they've lived through an economic crisis, and they don't take things for granted, but they don't necessarily believe that politics is the way to make change because they've seen a lot of bad examples. And so, you know, you talk to these kids and they say, well, you know, let's just create an app. You know, let's do social media. And all of that is very powerful and it shouldn't be dismissed, but it's not a substitute for the work of governing that we have to do. Government could learn something from that, but we have to, and you know, I always tell them Congress is going to meet with you or without you. The state legislature is going to meet with you or without you. So you either get in there and try and turn that wheel, or you live with the consequences of decisions that other people are going to make. And the goal at the Institute of Politics, which is an extracurricular program, is to expose these young people to practitioners in politics. And frankly, it's a nonpartisan institute. I brought people, I had Mitt Romney there last week. You know, we've had politicians from Elizabeth Warren to Ted Cruz speak there. We send the kids on paid internships to the White House and other agencies of government, state and local, as well as federal, not-for-profits, media. We run a fellows program where practitioners come and spend some time on campus and really mentor these kids. And, you know, my hope is that, and we're beginning to see some, even in these first few years, that we're going to measure our success by the number of these young people who do get in the arena. And I think they have the capacity to change the world, you know. So I'm very excited about it.
Good. Let's take just a couple of questions. If you're in the seating bowl, press down on the rim, not on the ball, but on the rim. If you're in the back, Steve has a microphone, and if we can hear you.
I'll give you this one.
Okay, mine is out, okay. Go ahead, please. On the rim there. Just, there you go. Just hold, keep your
My question had to do with President Obama's first term and during the bailouts. The one thing that did not happen was assistance for homeowners. And since there were so many houses went into foreclosure, it really led to a lot of urban decay in cities. And sometimes I wonder, why didn't he just tell his advisors, figure it out, but make sure these homeowners stay in their homes, as opposed to listening to them and say, we can't do it. And because if you tell people to find the answer, they'll find the answer. Yeah. So how did all that come about, and why didn't they find an answer?
I can't tell you how many meetings I sat in where he said exactly that. I mean, I see. Oh, I see. I get it now. You all heard the question, though, right? You didn't hear the question either? Well, then I can answer any question I want. The question was, why didn't the president essentially command his people to find an answer to the housing crisis that was exacerbated by the financial collapse because there was widespread devastation. And the answer is, I sat in. I don't think there was a subject that he came back to more often than this one, and there were an array of programs that they came back with, all of which were designed to try and address this problem. And you know, some have been more successful than others, but none of them as successful as we had hoped or had moved as fast as we had hoped. The other issue was, you know, real frustration because there was a sense that we had come to the assistance of these financial institutions and now they weren't lending. And that was a constant topic within, and very pointed topic between him and his economic advisors. And, you know, I'm not making alibis in any way, but it would turn out to be a much more complicated problem to solve than you would think, partly because one of the reasons we have a crisis now, is this still working? It's not, huh? Now? Anyway? Oh. Anyway, one of the reasons we had a financial crisis was because financial institutions were lax in their lending and gave loans on terms they shouldn't have given loans to people who couldn't afford to pay them back. And that was how we got in the crisis. And the supervisors, the independent supervisors who were supposed to oversee banks, really were lax in their oversight. They then overcorrected, and banks were very, this is part of the problem, were very reluctant to lend because they were fearful, they overcorrected. So there are a series of problems. And that's the story. There were a series of problems. But all I can tell you is this was a constant, in the 2 years I was there, a constant refrain of his with his economic advisors. And they came back with program after program. $50 billion was put in a fund to try and help homeowners. You know, there was a lot of debate. I was for cram down to change the way bankruptcy worked. But that would have been helpful. There was a lot of debate about that. But we just never got to where we wanted to get on that. No question about it.
Let me take another question here. Well, we'll go right down to the front row. Yes.
You talked about the 8 strategists that were in the room. Was Oprah in the room? And how much did she have to do with him deciding to run?
Oprah was not in the room when we decided when we were thinking about whether he should run for president. She was helpful, particularly there was a period of time around the beginning of the campaign, the actual campaign, around the Iowa caucuses and some of the early primaries where she did a fly around for us in which we attracted huge crowds because she was obviously someone people wanted to see. You know, I don't think she would describe herself as an integral player in our campaign, but she was a great help. She was a great help.
Other questions? I want to try and be fair. Let me go to the back of the room. Hang on a second. I'm using up a minute here, having Steve walk all the way across the floor. But if you can keep the question brief, too, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm interested in your perspective on the influence of the Koch brothers and their ilk on state politics and on the 2016 presidential race.
Do you guys hear the question? So, look, I think we are living in a new Gilded Age. You know, we had one at the end of the 19th century when there was this rapid change in our economy because of the Industrial Revolution, and you saw the emergence of the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and others who became dominant forces in our politics. And Teddy Roosevelt came along in the progressive era and took that on and limited the amount of money that basically forbade corporations from participating and really changed the way things were done. We're in a new Gilded Age now because of changes in our economy. You've got these people who are fantastically wealthy who now, unbridled by the Supreme Court ruling in a citizen action case, are now leveraging huge influence in our politics because there's no limit to what they can spend. And let me just say, parenthetically, I grew up in the, I came of age at a time when we saw great abuses, the Watergate era and so on. And I was, and I continue to be a believer in campaign finance reform and concept. But we have to acknowledge that what we've succeeded in doing, and the Supreme Court ruling didn't help here, but we have not created a system where there's less money, but we've created a system that is far sneakier because now a lot of this money is unaccounted for. They come through these contrivances that we've created a cottage industry for lawyers to figure out how to circumvent the system. And so you've got these charitable organizations, 501c4s and 6s that like the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, that where you have to account for where your money came from. And yes, they've been very influential. I think their influence, though, is felt less in national politics than it is in state and local politics. And you've seen it in Wisconsin. They've invested a lot in legislative races. They've invested a lot in in local races, in some cases school board races, city council races. And I think just as a clinical matter, I think they've been very deft at how they spend their money in terms of laying a foundation for the Republican Party to take over 30 state legislatures. They've created a bench for that party. So, whatever you think about the Koch brothers and whatever you think about the oligarchy that has emerged in our politics, and I'm very concerned about it, they're very good at what they do.
I'm going to wrap things up there because it's 1:15.
I'm sorry,
no,
I'm long-winded.
No, that's all right. Before we go, just a couple of pieces of business. Number one, and bear with me here, on Thursday, we will be back in this room. We're going to be unveiling a new website, interactive website. It's the product of work done by both the law school and the Public Policy Forum. We'll be looking at how we pay for regional and cultural assets, an important discussion that will allow citizens to make their own decisions about how we should pay for it. And so you're welcome to join us then. And also, Mr. Axelrod is going to take a few media questions after we wrap up here. And then at 1:30, the book signing will begin, and that's up on the second floor, it's my understanding. So I just want to tell all of you how much we appreciate your time, your interest, your attention today, and most of all, we want to thank David Axelrod for being with us. Thank you.